Hello everyone. Welcome very much to our UCU Scotland election hustings event today. I hope there are many of you here to ask questions, listen and get ready to vote later on. My name is Lena Wanggren. I am the Vice President of UCU Scotland, and in a couple of minutes I'll be handing over to Carlo Morelli, our President, and also to the politicians who are joining us to answer your questions today. But first, I want to quickly run through some of the key areas from our UCU Scotland manifesto that we're launching in time for the Holyrood elections. As Vice President, I chair UCU Scotland's Education Committee, and for the past year we've been working on a paper setting out an alternative vision for higher education in Scotland. It's been written by UCU reps and officials, academic experts from all across Scotland, so it's the top team have been putting this together. You'll find the link for the paper in the email you received about the hustings. It's also on the UCU Scotland blog, so you can Google it as well. I'm going to show this very high-tech version of, oops. Oh, I can't. I was going to show you the high-tech version of the, here it is. It looks very pretty. That's why I wanted to share it with you all. So you can find that. And you can also find a shorter version of this paper on the UCU Scotland website, I think, as well as the UCU UK website. The whole paper, it's 42 pages long. It's a great read, but if you wanted to have a shorter version, the manifesto is only 6 pages. So do check that out. Now, the Scottish Parliament elections are taking place at a critical time for the country, with the pandemic and also an economic crisis possibly looming. Universities are unique in being central to addressing both of these challenges. Universities and their staff have been key to developing medical and public health responses to the pandemic and advising governments. And we are also key to driving the economic recovery. We want UCU branches and members to use this manifesto that we've made to contact their local candidates in the Scottish Parliament elections. I'm going to go through some of the things that we are calling on the next Scottish Government to do. And these include fully funding Scottish higher education, including the full cost of teaching, cutting the use of precarious cashless contracts, which leave many staff in ill health and sometimes destitute, and also which doesn't really give them the full potential to do the kind of work that they could do in terms of teaching and so on. Take action on runaway principals' pay. I know that we have had a question submitted about that, so I look forward to the answers to that. We would also ask the Scottish Government to ensure that universities sign up to the Fair Work agenda. We would also like a lowering of student-staff ratios in universities so that there is a maximum number of students per staff. This will enhance the student experience, and it would also reduce the spiraling staff workloads that we currently see. We would like the Scottish Government to reaffirm the Commission on widening access targets for fair access. We would also like them to set up a task group on automation and datification. UCU Scotland has produced a report on this, so I recommend you check that out as well. We would also like to see the Scottish Government to help us renew the effort to tackle inequality and discrimination on campus in order to make sure that all staff and students are included. Taking action on climate change, and also finally, ensuring our universities continue to be outward-looking institutions, welcoming students, staff and ideas from across the globe. It's quite a list, but we believe that this will put higher education in Scotland in the best place to get us through the pandemic, to play a full part in the recovery, and also to be the higher education sector that both students and staff and the wider community need and deserve. So do have a look at our alternative vision paper and our manifesto. You have the link. And now over to Carlo Morelli, our UCU Scotland President, to introduce our speakers today. Thanks, you.
Lena. Thanks. Thanks, Lena, and thanks everyone for listening to this. I'd like to thank the participants from all the main political parties who have agreed to speak. What we're planning to do here is we've got questions submitted by members, around 10. We're hoping to get through all of them. What we'll ask each speaker to do is to speak for just a minute on each question, and then we'll move on to the next question. And that will give plenty of time for each of the speakers to comment on different aspects of their manifesto, but also the issues around higher education. So I'll read out the questions as we go along, and we'll take the candidates in this order, and then I'll move them on one person at a time for each question, so everyone gets a chance to be first and last in the questions. So let me welcome the speakers we've got here today. We've got Carol Monaghan, who's MP, who's the SNP spokesperson for education, the armed forces and veterans in the House of Commons. We have Michael Marra, who is the Scottish Labour candidate and education spokesperson. Ross Greer, MSP, for the Scottish Greens, education spokesperson, and Beatrice Wishart, MSP, Scottish Liberal Democrats, education spokesperson. We should be joined shortly by Jamie Greene, MSP for the Scottish Conservatives, who again is the Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills. I understand he's currently speaking in the First Minister's question times, and Carol can stay for around till about 2 o'clock. So hopefully we'll get through all the questions by nearly all by then, because again she's got to be in the House of Commons for questions there. So thanks everyone for participating, and thank you everyone for attending this. Let me start off with the first question, and I'll start with Carol and then move on to Michael. So the first question is, we know that Scottish higher education is underfunded. Audit Scotland says the teaching grant doesn't cover the full cost of teaching. There's a welcome consensus on keeping Scottish education free from tuition fees. So as Education Minister, how would you ensure government fully funds higher education? So Carol.
Thanks very much, Carlo. And first of all, you totally agree with the premise of the question. We're a party that abolished tuition fees in Scotland and will maintain that situation. We believe that education should be based on the ability to learn, not the ability to pay. But I think we've got to recognise that there's been 10 years of austerity here forced upon us by Westminster, and throughout that the Scottish Government has maintained funding for higher education, and next year we'll see an increase of nearly 30 million for a higher education budget. But whilst in Scotland we have a slightly smaller budget for teaching, we have slightly larger for research. So overall, the budgets for universities even out. And I think a bigger challenge for us is what we're seeing just now coming from Westminster with slashes to UKRI's budget. And I think that's going to be a real concern. Already we've seen contracts had to be paused halfway through, and hopefully I'll have a time to say more about that. Thanks, Carlo.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for being so kind at stopping. And I do apologise for interrupting everybody. So over to Michael.
Thanks, Carlo, and thanks for having me along today. Clearly, the underfunding of undergraduate education in Scotland is, I think, one of the most significant structural problems that we have in our universities. We know that, in essence, I think the business model that universities are pursuing is broken. We have where the Scottish government forced them to subsidise Scottish students by bringing other students from abroad or the rest of the UK and the EU into Scotland. And that actually fundamentally sets the direction of travel that institutions are taking as businesses that have to drive up those numbers, make sure that they can pay those bills, rather than focusing on the kind of education that should be required. So it's not just about the numbers, it's about the actions that flow from it. And Labour's been absolutely clear. Prior to 2007, when we abolished tuition fees, we fully funded higher education in Scotland through the graduate endowment. That was removed by the Scottish Government under the SNP, and that funding gap has never been plugged. So we need to make sure that money is replaced. We need to make sure that the universities in Scotland are freed from this millstone that's put around their neck, and frankly undermines at times the whole purpose of the education system, but can give financial security and stability to these institutions so they can deliver for children, young people in Scotland.
Can I tell you thank you? Thank you, Michael. Okay, over to Ross Greer, MSP.
Thanks, Carlo, and afternoon, everyone. To start off with, I agree absolutely with Michael's observation. Because public funding doesn't equal the teaching costs, it means uni finances are essentially houses built on sand, that being the international student income that you mentioned, and also income from accommodation. And we've seen how unsustainable that is, but also the mission creep that creates in the profit generating elements of a university's operation, and the focus that ends up being put on those at the expense of teaching and of research. If this is a question, though, about how do we fund it, how do we get to a situation where public funding equals the cost of teaching, it's then a question of general taxation and our priorities. So, I mean, you would expect there's areas of the budget, Scottish Government budget, I would cut back on. I think the motorway budget is bloated. But if we're talking about raising revenue here, 3 years ago, the Greens secured a change in income tax. The richest people in Scotland pay more in income tax. That's raised about £500 million more for our public services. And actually, people on the lowest incomes now pay a little bit less than they would if they were elsewhere in the UK. We need to go further, though, not just with income tax, but we need to be looking at other taxes as well. This should be about general taxation. We shouldn't be coming up with specific revenue streams to fund specific areas of spending. Our general taxation policy should be progressive enough to fund everything that we believe is socially necessary.
Thank you, Michael. Ross, I do apologise. And the final one of the speakers is Beatrice.
Thanks, and thanks to UCU for asking me along today. I mean, the pandemic has obviously shown how valuable and these institutions are, and they are absolutely vital to the recovery from the pandemic. But we know that there was underfunding before the pandemic, and I think it was to the tune of about 157 million. It was below the full cost of actual provision. So, and also institutions becoming increasingly reliant on commercial activity and international students who can't be seen as a cash cow to this. So yes, we would robustly fund universities and colleges. And while everybody today is claiming credit for abolishing tuition fees in Scotland, I would just point out that it was under a Lib Dem minister in coalition with Labour.
Thank you, Beatrice. That was really short and good. Thank you very much. Okay, as next question, which is related, is one of the big financial issues in universities, and that is the pension schemes. We've had two questions on this, so we'll take them both one after the other. So the first one is about the USS pension scheme that affects academic and academic-related staff. The question is, we've seen the biggest ever strikes in universities over changes to the USS pension in the last couple of years. There is dissatisfaction from employers and UCU over the administration of the scheme, and a belief that the latest scheme valuation is deeply flawed and unaffordable for all. How do you ensure university staff are have a properly run pension scheme that provides a secure retirement and is affordable, especially for early career staff? And if I can ask Michael to start.
Thanks, Carlo. I mean, I declare an interest on this as a contributor and a member of the USS pension scheme. I mean, it is a huge concern. I mean, pensions are deferred wages. You know, they are an entitlement that people have when they pay into it. But it's terms and conditions of their contract that they should have, the pensions that they are entitled to. And I actually think it undermines the kind of much of the goodwill that many of these institutions frankly operate on, that people don't take up other opportunities elsewhere and continue to commit themselves to teaching and education and research within these and the vocation that they have within our institutions to make sure that they have a sound pension in retirement is just the commensurate side of that. How do we sort that? I mean, I share concerns regarding the valuation process. I think that the last valuation round was proven to be flawed. And by analysis, so that we could ask similar questions of this one, I believe, and what I've seen so far would beg some of those questions. We have to ensure that.
Thank you, Michael. If I can,
we have to ensure that it's properly funded.
Yeah. Okay. On to Ross. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, thanks. I remember being out on picket lines over the previous round of action. In fact, if I'm remembering right, one of the previous rounds of action coincided with the Beast from the East, and we were all standing there when we realised that a red weather warning was coming in. I mean, it's been mentioned already that the flawed valuation for the scheme. I mean, my understanding was that the last round of valuation was so flawed. It was essentially based on the premise of what would happen if the whole university sector went bust overnight. The workings that they were using for the valuation clearly were flawed, but that to me raises a question of governance. The scheme is poorly governed. There's not nearly enough involvement from those like Michael who've contributed to the scheme in the governance of it. I mean, this is not unique to the USS fund. Pension funds, particularly in the public sector, but across the board, are typically governed in a way that is far too opaque. It doesn't give nearly enough involvement to those who've actually invested in the scheme. And that's the kind of governance change that we need to see in it. But I mean, very simply right now with the USS valuation, it's simply a ridiculous premise that it's based on. It's based on the premise that the whole sector could go bust overnight. That's clearly not the case. The scheme is actually financially really quite healthy.
Okay, thank you, Ross. And next on to Beatrice, and then we'll go to Carol.
Yeah, just following on from what Ross was saying. I mean, the whole transparency issue of seeing the clarity around how the analysis was carried out and whether it is properly funded or not. But it's trust and faith. People have got to have trust in where they are putting, where the part of their income is going to each month. And it's for people who make a career in higher or further education, they've got to have absolute confidence in the scheme going forward. So I do think it's about starting at the top with the governance and people being able to have trust and faith in what's available.
Thank you, Beatrice. And Carol, would you like to comment?
Thanks very much, Carlo. Yeah, I mean, I think we're all in agreement about how this scheme was valued, and certainly most of us would be of the opinion that it was undervalued in terms of contributions and what people were to expect out of it. And like Ross, during the last strike action, I joined some of my constituents on the picket line at Glasgow University to show some support. This isn't unique to USS, but it is a huge frustration that is affecting a lot of people. There has to be an opportunity for those that are actually paying into the scheme to have some method of contributing to how the scheme is run, and some shared ability to operate within that. And I think this is an issue with many pension schemes, that we hand over the money and we hand over all control. There must be some control for those that are actually contributing as well.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you. Our next question is linked to that. It's about the specific changes that are taking place in Dundee University and Abertay University, so across the city. And the question is, and this affects lower paid members of staff, so typically members of the Unison and Unite trade unions. And the question is, we're also seeing universities trying to reduce the pension benefits for support staff, with Dundee and Abertay universities seeking to move away from defined benefit pension schemes to defined contribution schemes for their support staff. What are your views on these attempts? So if we can start with Ross.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is a direct attack on the deferred wages of some of the lowest paid staff at both of the universities. I mean, I've been speaking to some of the folk from Unite at Dundee. It's absolutely shocking. I mean, these are staff who not only are some of the lowest paid, often on the most precarious contracts, the poorest conditions. These are the staff who have continued to work throughout the pandemic. These are the staff who've literally kept facilities going, made sure that the place was safe, that it was clean, etc. So what's being done to them is frankly disgusting. I think Unite and you mentioned Unison represent some of them as well, are right to be escalating this. There's a question about how much the government can intervene here, and I think the Scottish Government are often far too cautious in saying, we're not the employer, the universities are independent institutions, etc. Universities are overwhelmingly publicly funded institutions, and what I would want to see is a much more muscular response from government, respecting obviously, independent academic institutions are important, but if this is a government that aspires to a fair work agenda in Scotland, then those that are giving huge amounts of work to should be obligated to sign up to that fair work agenda. And a direct attack on the pensions of the lowest paid staff, that's not a fair work agenda. So as much as unequivocally condemn the universities themselves, I would expect the government to be stepping in here.
Thank you, Ross. And over to you, Beatrice.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not acceptable to have a go at the lowest paid staff, and I mean, everybody should be getting a fair deal. So I think I would I would. I don't know I don't have the, minute detail of what's going on, but I certainly would support further intervention to make sure that people do get a fair deal on their pensions.
Thank you. And Carol.
Thanks. I mean, the difficulty here is that with these moves, we're creating a two-tier system of employees. And unfortunately, those that are on the receiving end of this are often those that are working the longest hours, often with caring responsibilities, and often not with the time to actually come together and fight this in a strategic way. I'm glad that Unite is involved in this. I'm glad that the unions are taking some action on this. But I do think there is a difficulty. I mean, Ross seems to think the Scottish Government can interfere in a pension scheme. There is a difficulty with interfering in the independence of academia, and I think we have to respect that as well. Whereas, yes, we can make strong statements of support of these workers and look for what we are, the sort of support that we are after. I think there is also a danger that we start interfering, and that's unfortunately a line that you do not want to cross as government.
Thank you, Carol. And Michael, would you like to comment finally?
Yeah, I mean, these people are you and I colleagues, Carlo. We work alongside them every day at the university in Dundee, and I'm lucky enough to have been working from home over that period. Yes, homeschooling the kids, but so many of those members, support staff, friends of mine for many years, have continued to go in to support students and to keep those buildings operational. So they deserve their pensions. This is some kind of thank you, frankly, for the service that they have given over the pandemic. So I would say to Carol that this is one of the consequences of where we started off with. So if you don't fund education properly, then cost cutting will come somewhere else. And what is happening, so the Scottish Government are one of the interfering parties in this process because they're refusing to fund undergraduate education properly. It ends up with institutions trying to balance the books on the backs of the poorest workers. So I've asked for meetings with Jim McGeorge, Secretary of the University. I'll be raising this with the Principal directly, and the people who are campaigning have my absolute full support and the support of the Labour Party.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Just to summarise some of the points there about the last set of questions. The change to the USS pension scheme will mean somewhere of the order of at least £50 million a year is going to go, possibly double that, into the pension scheme out of the Scottish Government's budget for higher education. So we as a trade union would actually welcome the Scottish Government's input into the questions around the valuations of USS, and similarly into the way in which these schemes in Dundee and Abertay are being valued, because the valuations are clearly based upon some assumptions which are wildly inaccurate and driving these schemes into closure. So thanks very much for that, everyone's comments. The next couple of questions we've got are around equality. So the first one, and I'll start with Beatrice if we may. The Black Lives Matter movement has increased the calls to decolonise education, its structures and its curriculum. There is resistance to these calls. What would you do to change this? So Beatrice.
Well, I think you need to start by looking at everything holistically. I think you can't sort of pick off elements of it. I think there needs to be a wide-ranging discussion so that everybody's views are put forward and come to consensus on how you move forward. I think that I can understand. I think well, it's really it's quite complex. I think that you can't sort of take one element out of what we've got and then and focus on that. I think there needs to be a completely holistic approach. I think we need to. I certainly think there needs to be more discussion about it and how we do move things forward. And I don't think that we can stand still with what we've got at the moment, with so much having been written out of history, and that includes women's involvement in what's happened in the past. So I think there's a lot more to be done.
Okay, thank you. So over to Carol again. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carlo. And I think one of the big things to come out of the Black Lives Matter movement is how much racism is embedded in many of the things that we say and do. But I would also kind of countenance that by saying people in the west of Scotland were some of the poorest people in the world at some point. Certainly my ancestors were not in any way involved in the slave trade. In fact, were probably treated in a similar way to many of the slaves that we're talking about. So I think there's got to be an understanding of that situation as well. I do have some difficulties with the complete removal of that part of history, which none of us are proud of. I think it's important that we do recognise what went wrong in the past, and by taking everything out, we don't necessarily actually address the problems that we still have today.
Thank you. And next speaker is Michael.
Sorry, unmuting there. I mean, Carol makes an interesting point. I mean, my family, up until the last generation, worked in the jute mills in Dundee, and those jute mills made their money, or the predecessors to them in the linen industry in particular, making the cloth that was on the backs of American slaves. And people who worked in the jute mills knew that at the time, or in the linen mills knew that at the time. That was one of the major areas, and one of the benefactors that have given money to my home city in Dundee, in Baxter Park and other areas, and actually the university. Mary Baxter, the founder of our university, her family made most of their money in terms of the big increase in cash came off the back of that slave trade. So there's really complex lines in terms of our history on that, and we have to recognise as a country, Scotland, that we were one of the drivers of empire in terms of the exploitation that took place across the subcontinent and right across the world. And we have to take, I think, a more active role in recognising the implications of that and the colonialism globally. So I think there's some great examples of work that's gone on. Glasgow University's approach on this has been really good, and we can do a lot more to share best practice. But I think we really need an intellectual approach that gathers some of what Beatrice has said as well.
Okay, and finally, Ross, do you want to comment?
Yeah, thanks. There's definitely more progress being made on this now, not nearly enough. I mean, last summer the Greens proposed a motion to Parliament that Scotland should have a national slavery museum, and we won Parliament's backing for that. So hopefully we'll see that greater national cultural recognition of our own history there. And, you know, like Michael said, Glasgow Uni's approach of reparations, I think, is a really welcome one. The question, though, was about the resistance that comes to trying to decolonise the curriculum. A key way that we tackle that is by diversifying staff bodies, particularly at senior management level. The resistance to decolonising the curriculum is not coming from people of colour who work at senior levels in our universities. The people who resist it the most are people who have no experience of, no direct experience of racism themselves. So diversifying your senior management is absolutely key to that. This is an area, though, where as much as I think government involvement in issues of like paying conditions is absolutely valid when institutions are publicly funded, direct government interference in the curriculum, I think, is much less acceptable. But it is the kind of area that we can collaborate on, looking into stuff like an independent review across the sector, trying to get broad points of agreement. I think it is the kind of area that we can operate on the basis of some level of consensus. It's not somewhere where the government should be interfering with curriculums, absolutely not.
Okay, thank you, Ross. Okay, back to Carol. This time is another equality question on gender. So the question is the Scottish Government has demonstrated some interest in tackling gender-based violence on campus with support for Equally Safe in Higher Education and the Emily's Test initiative. What more would you do as Minister to ensure that there is zero tolerance of sexual violence and harassment on campus and people, including university management, are held accountable? So, Carol, would you like to start?
Thanks. I think we're miles away from where we have to be on this issue, and I mean, it's good that we're all able to talk about this now, but when we know that 95% of sexual assaults are still not reported, we have a major challenge here. This is a situation where we have young people thrown together from different backgrounds, different expectations, but we must listen to them. And part of that means that we need a more a closer look at diversity. We need to look at how many women are actually employed. We have to look at voices for them, and we have to ensure that there are proper structures in place to allow students to report even minor incidents so that these can be tackled, because until we deal with the reporting, we're not going to get a full picture. So we're in the very start of a journey as far as this is concerned.
Thank you, Carol. So next participant is Michael.
Yeah, we need to do an awful lot more. I agree with Carol's points on this. I mean, this was an issue that was raised with some of us at the NUS Hustings in terms of the work that students and student bodies want to see carried out. They had a particular focus on non-disclosure agreements and banning those around when complaints are made. And my response to that was, I think that is a question that the UCU and NUS need to work together on to make sure that we can to do more to prevent those kind of facilities being available, and where appropriate, and they're only used in appropriate circumstances. So there are ways that universities can handle this appropriately, but we need a real focus on this. There's a long history of exploitation and discrimination on our university campuses, in common with most institutions, and as places that should be safe for learning and the development of people, and places of free expression, we need to do an awful lot more to make sure that we can combat this gender-based violence.
Thank you, Michael. Next is Ross, if that's okay.
Yep, thanks. The issue of non-disclosure agreements in cases of sexual assault and sexual harassment that Michael mentioned, I thought it was a really interesting one when it was brought up at the NUS Hustings. And it's the kind of area where I think, given that colleges are public bodies, government and parliament can be far more directly instructive on where it is and is not appropriate to be using NDAs. With universities, it's obviously more complicated because they are independent bodies. But from what I've been told, there's certainly far too widespread a use of those to silence the survivors of sexual assault rather than to deal with the problem. There's been a lot of work over the last couple of years on making consent workshops a key part of Freshers' Weeks, for example. But to be honest, if we've got to the point where students, young people are arriving at university and that's the first time they've learned about consent, that's a failure if it's taken that long. We know that's the case, though. 3 in 4 young people across the UK leave school having got relationships and sex education, but it wasn't consent-based. 3 in 4 don't get consent-based sex ed. That's not acceptable. The first thing that I did when I was elected back in 2016 was ask the Education Committee to look into this, to look into personal social education in our schools. And we did. We had a really great committee inquiry into it. The government committed to a review off the back of it, and changes are being made. So over the next couple of years, we should get to a point off the back of the work that Parliament's Education Committee did, where every young person in Scotland, when they're receiving relationships and sex education, has consent-based sex, because if it's not consent-based, frankly, it shouldn't be happening at all.
Thank you, Ross. And finally, Beatrice, would you like to give your view?
Thanks, Carlo. Ross has just stolen my thunder, talking about consent-based education at school, because he's right. If you've got to university or college and you're only starting to understand what consent actually means, there is a serious problem. And Ross will recall last week we heard from some young advisors from the Children's Commissioner's Office, and one of them was saying that one of the sex education is from usually from pornography. So I mean, that is not a helpful way for anybody, any young person, to learn about what's consent. I think the other thing we have to do, and I probably should declare an interest here, as I'm a member of Shetland Women's Aid, and obviously domestic violence and gender-based violence is something that is it happens everywhere in every part of society, and what we need to do is to stop victim blaming as well. But going back to what Michael and Carol were saying, there needs to be proper structures so that when this is reported, it is dealt with properly, sensitively, and ensure that there is a proper outcome.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you. Okay, next question again looks at issues, or next couple of questions look at issues around access to higher education. So our first question is on inequality. And the question is, Scotland has met the first of the Commission on Widening Access targets for 16% of students in institutions to be from the SMID 20 backgrounds. The remaining targets to get us to 20% by 2030 are likely to be tougher given the impact of COVID on poverty and inequality. Are you committed to fair access as a priority, and how do you ensure we meet the 2030 targets? And I believe we're starting with Michael this time. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm glad to see in our chat, Carlo, we might get a little bit more time on this question, because I think to me it's the one of the absolutely core questions about higher education. You know, as a means of progressing social mobility, giving people a chance of making a better life for themselves and their families and their communities. So you know, it's absolutely critical and core to everything the Labour Party believes in terms of education and more broadly as socialists. I would say that they. Actually, you know, it's taken a long time to improve those figures, and what we've seen in Scotland is actually, despite the scrapping of tuition fees by Labour and Lib Dems under its previous executive, we have failed over the fourth of the year since then to actually widen access appropriately. So you're right though, Carlo, in terms of this question, whoever put it in, real challenges coming out of the pandemic. I know that articulation from colleges into universities is going to be a particular challenge. We're seeing college applications dropping by a third under the pandemic. We're seeing a lack of completions from last year. So a real logjam in terms of the people that are coming through those routes into HE, which is a real concern. And we need to make sure, given what you've referenced as well, the poverty figures that are going to increase dramatically, that we need to make sure that we increase the kind of guarantees that are put in place for people to make sure that we can get them in. And part of that is about income. So we believe in a minimum student income, a guarantee for that, to make sure that we can support people into university in a very practical way when they've got the grades to do it, and they're not put off from the economic impact that it will have on them long term. And the last part of that, I think, is about prospects for when they leave. We need to make sure that the figures we saw yesterday on youth unemployment are just terrifying. You know, 88% of jobs lost in this pandemic have been to people under the age of, I think it was 28. I could be wrong on that, but certainly youth unemployment is the massive majority of it. And we need to make sure that we build an economy that can give people opportunities and make it worthwhile to get your degree.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so I'm suggesting everyone can have a minute 20 if necessary for each question. Now we've got a little bit more time. Okay, over to Ross next.
Thanks. I'm going to start with one positive on this one because I think it's really interesting. As a result of last year's SQA grading shambles being reversed and all those grades being restored to what the teachers had originally submitted, more working class young people have applied directly from school to university this year than in any previous year, which I think shows what the outcomes are when you actually give working class young people an opportunity to be graded fairly. Like, we've got a school exam system that structurally discriminates. It embeds the inequality. The idea that far more young people could achieve top grades is simply not seen as credible. We ration those grades. So I'm really interested to see what happens once they get the results this year, once we see who arrives at university in September, because I think that's shown if you address these problems in our school level exam and assessment system, you can massively widen access with a few short steps there. Doesn't mean they're actually able to stay at university once they get there though. So we do need to be doing stuff like converting loans to grants. We need that minimum student income. We need to address the cost of living for students. So from probably August of this year, certainly before universities start, everyone under 22 in Scotland will be able to travel on the bus for free. That was one of the things that the Greens negotiated in the last national budget that we set a couple of weeks ago there. We also need stuff like specific summer hardship funds. We know that a lot of working class young people who've made it to university get through their first year and then drop out the following summer because of financial pressures. And that's actually a time at which the institutions themselves are particularly poor at that kind of direct support. So a specific summer hardship fund would go a long way to preventing that really acute problem of dropout that we've got in the summer between first and second year.
Thank you, Ross. And now on to Beatrice.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's once that students actually do manage to get in the door. I mean, there's issues about how they are funded. We know that bursaries and grants have been totally decimated, and obviously, lower income people from lower income backgrounds have been hit the hardest. And the other thing to consider is, when we're looking at ongoing student finance, as Ross was highlighting there, some students, we know that there's reports about students being forced into high interest loans to plug the gap. I mean, that is just not sustainable. We want to make sure that the system of bursaries and grants are restored and help students have, you know, a minimum income level without forcing them into more debt. So that's one way of trying to ensure that when students actually get in the door, they are properly supported and they can get on with their studies and achieve the best outcome possible.
Thank you, Beatrice. And finally, Carol.
Thanks very much, Carlo. And I think the important point of this is without fair access, we miss talent, and we are certainly not in a position where we can afford to do that. And for the sake of the young people, or for the sake of the economy and for job creation. But we've got to look at what Scotland actually provides for young people, and we are making progress in this, decent progress, and it's got the best package of support for young people at university. It's got free tuition, it's got low interest rates for student loans, and it's got a minimum income guarantee for students here in Scotland. And with respect, because I try not to get too partisan, under Labour you couldn't graduate unless you paid your £3,000 graduation fee. So that's not quite free tuition. Couple of things that I think we need to look at, and some of the things that are being done with, we now see more universities looking at things like summer schools in order to access courses, and on completion of summer schools, even if they don't have the grades that were required, they can gain places. And I think we need to be seeing more of this. And I think we also need to look a bit more creatively about awards that are awards for university places that are given, because 5As from one school is not the same as 5As from another school. So there has to be a way of actually discerning where the talent actually is. And I know for a child coming from, or a young person from an area of deprivation, managing to get 5As says an awful lot more about that youngster than it does for some others. So we need to look at how our entrances are done, and let's try and think more creatively about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Carol. So our next question, again, about access. In this case, it's international exchange and some of the experiences students get when they're in universities. This question is, the UCU Scotland Congress on Friday, this coming Friday, will debate calls for Scotland to be part of the Erasmus scheme. In a post-Brexit world, how would you support universities to continue to be outward-looking institutions and welcome staff, students, and ideas from across the globe? And if we can start with Ross, I believe, this time.
Thanks. It's a shame that Jamie's not been able to join us, because you've got 4 parties here who support the Erasmus scheme and no Conservative to defend the cultural vandalism that they've inflicted for no other reason, it seems, than spite. The Turing scheme that the UK government are presenting as a replacement to Erasmus, everyone here, everyone watching will know it is far, far less than Erasmus. It is not an equivalent for it. So what can we do in Scotland? There's a couple of different things. I'm, in the first instance, really proud of the fact that it's the 2 members of the European Parliament from Germany who are leading the effort for Scotland to be able to participate in Erasmus. One of them is a German, Greene, Terry Reinke, a friend of mine who was an Erasmus student at Edinburgh University, and the other's a Christian Democrat whose parents are Scottish. So there is a lot of goodwill across Europe for Scotland's continued participation. We should use the political capital, the goodwill Scotland's built up over the last 6 years. We should use that on something like Erasmus. But there are direct interventions we can take as well. The Welsh government have decided that they're going to set up their own Erasmus equivalent to make sure that they're trying to get as close to that scheme as possible. Scotland should do something very similar to that. It goes beyond just Erasmus, though. We need to do far more. We need to put way more pressure on the UK government in terms of post-study work visas. That's been an amazing initiative. We were in a ridiculous situation for years with that. We need to see a significant expansion of it. There's a lot more that we can do to support international students coming here, Scottish students travelling abroad. That kind of collaboration is of immense value, not just to them as individuals and to their institutions, but it's of immense societal value to Scotland, to Europe, and to all the other countries who participate. So there's far more we can do. We should keep pushing to try and take part in Erasmus as much as we possibly can. There's direct schemes we could set up, and we shouldn't waste our time involving ourselves with the touring scheme, because it's just not going to do the job.
Thank you, Ross. And the next person is Beatrice.
Yeah, this is really, I mean, the Erasmus has been a real casualty of Brexit. It's been a complete disaster. I mean, studying abroad that allowed young people to make friendships, as Ross said, build relationships and share that close working across Europe is absolutely vital. I mean, thousands have had that experience through Erasmus, and touring does not cut it to the same extent at all. And Ross is also right on the Welsh Lib Dem Education Secretary, Kirsty Williams. She's called for replacement funding for Erasmus to be given directly to devolved administrations. I think that's certainly something that worth considering, and we will work constructively with other governments to make sure that students come first and try and preserve the opportunities of study and exchange across Europe. I mean, I think it's vitally important.
Thank you, Beatrice. And Carol.
Thanks, Carlo. I think this might be one of these rare occasions where we have something called political consensus here, because I think we're all pretty devastated. I mean, the Prime Minister promised last year that there was absolutely no threat to Erasmus. In fact, in an answer to one of my colleagues' questions, he said he was talking through the back of his neck when he said there might be a threat. So, and here we see a year later, we're kicked out and these opportunities are lost. So, as others have said, I'm not going to repeat it. The Turing scheme doesn't replicate it. It's not going to offer the same opportunities. But the big issue I have is that we don't have inward exchanges, because there is so much to be learned culturally from these exchanges. And I was concerned to hear some of the other contributors earlier talking about international students as being a threat. International students must be seen as a real positive. We need them. We need people coming here to Scotland with their ideas, with their different ways of thinking. And the biggest issue I see is actually the lack of international students being able to come for these exchanges now to Scotland. It is something we need to work on a cross-party basis for. And if Wales have good ideas on this, then let's look at them and see what we can do.
Thank you, Carol. And finally, Michael.
Yeah, when I taught at Glasgow University on an unsecure part-time 0 hours contract under this SNP government, I have to say that actually international students in my seminar rooms were an extraordinary benefit to young Scots and to each other in terms of the mixed experience that they brought about different systems of politics, which is what I was teaching around the world. So I don't recognise those comments. You know, but what we were talking about was the funding of education, Carol, in terms of the way that institutions are forced into certain decisions. I think the cultural impact of people coming into our universities can't be understated. I mean, this is cultural vandalism in Ross's words. It is spiteful from the UK government. We will have a scheme in our manifesto to address it. And as internationalists, you know, throwing up borders, throwing up boundaries, you know, it's pulling people apart. The way out of this crisis is to collaborate more and to come together internationally as much as we can across these islands, across Europe and globally. And unfortunately, you know, it's a matter of pride, I think, for academics that they've been part of the solution when our governments have let us down.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, thanks for everybody for those comments. And next couple of questions relate to the experience of working in the sector for staff. And the first question is about the FE sector, in fact, not higher education, but our colleagues in EIS, the trade union, working in further education. The question here relates to a dispute that is starting in the FE colleges this week. And I'll read the question. It's EIS FELA, that's Further Education Local Association, comrades in the college sector, in dispute over some colleges replacing lecturers with instructors. Do you support the national agreement reached that teaching in colleges should be undertaken by professional lecturers? What would you do? What do you think, rather, about the management side walking away from this agreement that they had negotiated. So let me start with Beatrice.
Well, I think when an agreement has been reached, that people should stick by it, and I don't agree by being seen to devalue what lecturers do. So, I mean, we know that our colleges and our universities are absolutely essential from our recovery from the pandemic, and if we don't, we rely on the staff to help us through that, and if we don't have a staff that feel valued and are paid accordingly, then we will not be able to get through this. People should be treated fairly and with the proper working conditions.
Thank you. Next is Carol.
Thanks very much. And Carlo, for 2 years I was a university teacher, not lecturer. So I think there probably is some opportunities within higher and further education that there are different roles for different people. I think that the problem here is that we're asking people that are employed as lecturers to change roles and be employed as something else. I mean, we're seeing all sorts just now in many different sectors around fire and rehire under poorer conditions. So I think my feeling on it would be, if you're employed as a lecturer, you are a lecturer, that is the job you do. But there may be situations where an instructor or a teacher might be more appropriate depending on the particular role that they're undertaking. But in terms of colleges, college management, if an agreement has been reached, then that agreement should be stuck by. So I think it's quite disappointing to hear that.
Thank you. And next is Michael.
Yeah, when trade unions represent the workforce and come to the table in good faith, then you should expect the agreement that's reached and the distance that's been travelled by both parties to be respected. And I think this situation is completely intolerable. I mean, I really hope that the Education Secretary can pick up the phone to Colleges Scotland and just tell them, actually, look, you need to sort this out. This was something that was agreed. Get it delivered, and let's do our best to avoid industrial action. I believe it's tomorrow that certain members around Scotland are meant to be walking out. They certainly have my solidarity and support in that. And we need to make sure that there's a better relationship, a trusting relationship between the unions in terms of how they represent the workforce and with the management. And you can't have these kind of signals of bad faith. But the government, as Ross already pointed out, have much more powers within this sector. And frankly, I'm sure John Swinney has the Colleges Scotland staff on speed dial, and you should just give them a call and tell them to get this sorted out.
Thank you, Michael. Finally, Ross, would you like to have a word?
Thanks. Yeah, the Greens have been working with SFILA on this for about 5 years now, because it's the same thing that happens every year, where the union in good faith negotiate with management, come to an agreement, and then management spend weeks or even months trying to back out of that agreement. The union has to escalate it to strike action, and then they win. EIS have won every single year through the power of collective action. They've demonstrated the value of a trade union. The farce this year is the union agreed to the proposals brought by management, and then management backed away from their own proposals. So it was clearly a negotiating ploy. Management put it on the table, not expecting the union to agree to it, and thought they could play some games here. And they were outplayed. So we're in a really farcical situation. I challenged the Further and Higher Education Minister on this yesterday. Given that this has gone on for 5 years now, it's a consistent pattern of bad faith negotiating from college management. I think we need to move to a different kind of negotiation. Colleges are within the public sector. They are public bodies. At the moment, it's direct negotiation between the lecturers' union and college management. I think it needs to become tripartite negotiation now, because the government try to keep their hands off this and say it's got nothing to do with us, but it does. They're public bodies. They're funded through the Scottish Funding Council. The government need to take on their responsibility here and sort it out. What we also need to prevent us from even getting to this place in the negotiations every year is to make it a condition of SFC funding that colleges do not undermine the role of lecturers. We've got to a really good place now with college lecturers having their professionalism recognised. So to constantly be in a position where lecturers are being forced onto poorer paying conditions, having their posts converted, that's not acceptable. And you can, through the SFC funding process, simply stop that from happening. All of this just requires the government to actually get involved. And given that this is public bodies and public money. It's shocking that they've not done that for the last 5 years, and we're just here over and over and over again.
Thank you, Ross. Just like to welcome Jamie Greene. Jamie, my name is Carla Morelli. I'm the UCU Scotland president. I'm chairing this session. We've been talking about the dispute that's about to start in further education. I think you can see the question in the screen, but I'll just read it out to you again. And I think it will give you a chance to make your comment on the question, and then we'll move on to the other questions that we've got. I'm giving everyone a minute and 20 to contribute, but obviously you've not been here before for the other questions, so feel free to take a little bit longer if you want. But the question that everyone was just answering was linked to further education and our sister union EIS. And the question was, our EIS fellow comrades in the college sector are in dispute over some colleges replacing lecturers with instructors. Do you support the national agreement reached that teaching in colleges should be undertaken by professional lecturers? And what do you think about the management side walking away from the agreement that they had negotiated? So over to you, Jamie.
Thank you for that. And I just want to start by apologising for being late to the party. I was in the chamber asking some First Minister's questions, and I'm not sure if others have to do the same, but I have to go back to the chamber quite shortly. It's education portfolio today, and we all have a vested interest in education questions, and I've got another question. It's the last day of term, so I'm really sorry about that, but my office have been following proceedings and keeping me up to date on some of the topics that have been coming up, and I'd be happy to correspond with anyone who's interested in the future for my view on any of these issues, including our own plans as we head into the manifesto season. So just want to make that commitment on the record, and I'm happy to take any of that offline. Anything that I've missed. So I just caught the tail end of Ross's answer to that. It's an issue that came up in the Parliament this week. It's a very, very live issue. I mean, I think, as a rule of thumb, generally, I don't, and it's no huge surprise that my party don't often support industrial action if it directly results in loss of learning and education. But I think obviously we're in a very different circumstance at the moment. Many young people are studying remotely and not. I think this is really disappointing, this whole issue. I think the college sector is facing enormous pressure financially. Huge cuts to its budget. It also is very restricted in its ability to raise money as it's fully funded from the public purse. And we know that year after year of consecutive cuts have left the sector struggling to make ends meet. The end result is it loses staff, it's reclassifying staff, or indeed it cuts places and courses. And I don't think that's to anyone's benefit. I'm sorry about that. We need to support the college sectors in post-COVID recovery. I would really implore both the college management and the unions and staff to sit down and try and work out. We cannot devalue lecturers' roles in any way, nor should we. They play a vital role in educating our young people on par with teachers and other forms of tertiary education. So I really implore people to sit around the table and try and negotiate a deal. But as Ross said, rightly, this happens every year. There's a systemic problem here. And I think partly that's down to the long-term financing issues that our colleges face. They need some long-term commitment of funding.
Thank you, Jamie. That's really helpful. Very kind of you to come. And I appreciate everyone's very busy. And our next question is, again, linked to the workloads and the experience of work for staff in the sector. This time it's higher education. And the question is, workload has always been an issue in higher education, but this has got worse in the past year as university staff have routinely worked the equivalent of 6 to 7 days a week during the COVID-19 crisis. What steps can government take to address staff workloads in the sector? And I believe we're starting with Carol, if I may.
Thanks very much. This is certainly a picture that I recognise. My husband teaches at university, and so I certainly understand the pressures that staff have been put under over the last year. Part of it, certainly in this household, is trying to get new equipment operating virtually. The constant tussles with this, and even when it is operating properly, it's quite different. I mean, I think we would all agree that we're trying to do the best worst possible situation here. So whilst he's trying to work with materials and trying to work remotely, there is always questions to be answered at the end of classes. There's always people wanting to speak to him. There are always more things that would be done so simply on a face-to-face basis. So yes, totally understand the situation. I would like to think that this is a situation that hopefully we're starting to see the end of, so we can start looking at this. But I think there also has to be an understanding and recognition from the employer of what staff are actually undertaking at the moment. And we have to look at ways in which this can be made easier for them, be it looking at number of classes, be it looking at number of students, or if it's simply we need to employ more people in order to do this. But I think there is a difficulty, but hopefully things are starting to look a bit brighter.
Thank you, Carol. And over to Michael next.
Yeah, as someone who runs a research centre in a university, I mean, I don't do much student-facing work these days, but frankly, I've been in awe of my colleagues who do, and they in those first weeks turning round an entire curriculum and putting it online, so essentially rewriting the entirety of courses, putting these things, producing the materials, not a case of being one page ahead of anybody in the textbook, but actually reforming whole courses and putting them online in that period of time. I mean, our university, as Carlo knows, has burnt millions of pounds on digital transformation strategies over years. And actually, we had in our school in science and engineering, frankly, one unbelievable woman who did an incredible amount of work to transform digitally the entire school for thousands of students. But everybody has been in behind that workload, and I would pay tribute to all staff over this last year. The question, what do we do about it now? I think it comes back to that original point about funding. I mean, Carol makes the point in terms of, smaller class sizes, in terms of fewer students, more staff. In order to do that, higher education has to be funded properly. It's the only way to address the issue of workload in a holistic way. Of course, there's more that different managers can do in different institutions, but unless we get the funding situation right, frankly, it'll be papering over the cracks.
Thank you, Michael. And next to speak is Ross.
Yeah, I don't want to just repeat what Michael said. I mean, I agree with it. Teaching is under-resourced because it's underfunded, and until we solve that problem, it will continue being the case. Even if we solve it, though, if universities are entirely adequately funded, the cost of teaching is met out of the public purse, it doesn't automatically solve it. It will almost certainly solve a lot of these problems. We still have a situation where universities themselves are incredibly poor employers, where they have staff entirely unnecessarily on 0 hours contracts, on very low wages. We know there are graduate teaching assistants, for example, who are in practice being paid less than the minimum wage, given the number of hours that they end up having to work. Not even just less than the real living wage, but less than the minimum wage because of how much is expected to them relative to their salary. That isn't automatically solved by having the funding meet the cost of teaching. It'll go a long way to doing it, but what we then need to do is start setting clear expectations. And it goes back to the points we discussed earlier of, as much as government shouldn't be interfering in the academic and the curricular side of what universities are doing, if it is an overwhelmingly publicly funded institution, then government and parliament have every right to set out basic standards of employment, and that should include a guaranteed at least the real living wage. We know people should be paid more than that. We're in a situation where people are being paid less than the minimum wage. The next step is to at least guarantee the living wage for the likes of teaching assistants.
Thank you, Ross. And over to Beatrice, and then we'll come to Jamie.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat what others have said either, but I mean, it does all come back down to funding. I mean, we know that across education, schools as well, everybody has worked phenomenally hard this last year, but you can't continue to overwork, and people will burn out. And we need, as we've said before, we need good quality teaching and learning for our students so that they are able to go on and be the benefit to our economy for the next 30, 40 years. But if we've got teaching staff who are absolutely worn out, that's not going to be achieved in any which way. One thing that we can be looking at is what better support can be put in for mental health treatment, so that access to early interventions to support staff in their health and well-being as they go forward.
Thank you, Beatrice. And finally, Jamie, do you want to get a chance to contribute?
Yeah, so the UCU did some great work on this in 2016, and it found 5 key things. The main striking finding that I discovered when I joined the Parliament was that staff are working an extra 2 days per week unpaid. The majority thought that their workload was unmanageable and unsustainable. And I think a large part of that is that the staff are taking on more responsibility in administration, as well as core teaching. And also, I think it's fair to say that student expectations have increased as well. And I think what's resulted in that is burnout, actually, over the last year. Now, it goes without saying, we all thank staff for what they've done, but that burnout is real. Over half of staff surveyed found that their mental health had suffered over the last year. So, I think there are a number of things that can be done. Money is a core part of it. Both the further and higher education sectors need to be properly funded, but equally staff need supporting as well. There needs to be a robust support system in place. We know that many students with additional support needs are also adding to the workload of teaching staff. And I just think they're really struggling to make ends meet. But I think we can take some positives out of COVID. Digital learning has taught us new ways to do things and streamline things, and working remotely is part of that. We need to make sure there's a better work-life balance for teaching staff as well. So, I think I'm hoping out of the end of this, we can come out with some positives, how we can change the workload for teaching. But I'm afraid to say 5 years on from that earlier report, those issues are still very alive, and I haven't seen much progress.
Thank you, Jamie. We've appreciate taking up everyone's time, and if we can have one last quick question, we'll start with Carol, because I know she has to leave to get back to the Parliament. The question is, as Further and Higher Education Minister, your total salary would be £94,800. Do you think the principal of Edinburgh University is worth 3 times as much as you on £342,000? If not, how will we tackle excessive pay of university principals? And I might just add to that, in my own university, if you came in on £94,800, you would be the lowest paid member of the university executive group. So over to Carol, and if we can limit everyone to a minute, then that would be helpful. Thanks, everyone.
I'll probably need to be 30 seconds, and I don't earn that amount because I'm not the Further and Higher Education Minister. So, yeah, I mean, principal salaries just seem utterly ridiculous to most of us. So I think we can all agree, looking at that, particularly when so many people have suffered over the last 12 months. That to see salaries of this size is frankly ridiculous. However, I come back to say, how do we tackle it? Universities will argue that they need the best people. How do we tackle it? Probably, I think we need to make strong representations to them. I have said before, I do have concerns about interfering in the independence of universities, but I think strong representations towards them would certainly be a good start.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for participating. It's been very helpful. Okay, the next is Michael.
Yeah, I don't think that the wage of a principal should be set in relation to the wage of the education minister. I think it should be set in relation to the lowest paid member of staff in the institution, and that a sensible multiple should be applied. So if the principal wants to raise his own wage, he has to start with raising the wage of the cleaners and the people who are in working teaching students as well. So I think that's probably the place I would come from. I don't hold out significant hope of becoming the education secretary in a few weeks, maybe under an SNP Green coalition. We'll maybe see Ross in that position. You never know. But if that's the case, let's hope that we can talk a little more about some of these substantive issues rather than just talking about another 5 years of division and constitutional wrangling.
Thank you, Michael. And over to Ross, possibly the next education minister.
Yeah, that's everyone but the Greens seems to be talking up the Greens' chances of getting into government, which that I'm fine with that. Yeah, I was glad that this question specifically mentioned the Principal of Edinburgh Uni, though, because I'm going to crowbar in a quick point and say I don't think he's fit for the office that he holds. This is someone who, at his previous institution in Hong Kong, took the side of Beijing over his own students and pro-democracy protesters. That's not a man who should have ever been welcomed back to the Scottish education sector, but that's a separate point. On the issue of pay, the first parliamentary reception that I held in 2016 after I got elected was for University of Scotland, and there was loads of folk from the UCU there. Some of whom are watching now and might remember this. I made myself very unpopular with some of them because in hosting their reception, I used my opening remarks to talk about their pay in relation to the pay of the lowest paid staff at their institutions, which was an interesting introduction to a group of principals, some of whom I hadn't actually met before. Michael's right, though. We should be looking at pay ratios here. I mean, I think 10-to-1 is the pay ratio that, we've tried that when the Greens ran Brighton Council. It was a 10-to-1 pay ratio that we were trying for there. 10-to-1 is miles away from what you've got when you've got a university principal and 350 grand. It would take quite a while to get to that. But again, this is the area. We're not interfering with academic freedom if we say that public funding is contingent on fair work practices and a decent pay ratio between those at the top and the lowest paid staff. That's a good example of fair working practice. So yeah, pay ratios are the solution here.
Thank you, Ross. And Beatrice, and then we'll come to Jamie, who'll have the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I think staff obviously deserve fair pay conditions and pensions, but when we've seen students facing real hardship this year without proper support and reports of students having to turn to food banks, I mean, that's deeply troubling. And when you compare that to some of the astronomical sums and salaries of what we've seen in university principals, I mean, it seems completely out of touch. So I don't think it's unreasonable to question how fair and sustainable that actually is.
Thank you, Beatrice. And Jamie, since you were latest here and missed much of it, would you like to be the last speaker and comment on this?
Thank you. Yeah, it's obviously always a controversial issue. And can I just say to Ross Greer, if he does become the next Education Secretary, I will give him my full support in many matters. I know he's a hard-working MSP. We're both returned from the West region, and I look forward to working alongside him if I return as well. So it's not all conflict in politics. But you know, this is a serious issue. This is a long-term issue. This has been going back over a decade. A 2012 review into higher education governance called for example, university remuneration committees. They would set the pay of principals so that they would be independent of the staff themselves, and also there would be a role for staff and students on some of these committees. I think that hasn't gone far enough. But equally, I come from the private sector before I came into politics, and very much pay was based on performance. And I think that needs to be looked at. You know, the metrics that are involved in grading people need to be relative to the success or otherwise of their institution. But we all know that universities have had to become businesses because they're so chronically underfunded. And I think that partially that's been the cause of this huge rise in pay, is they've now just become, they've had to find new ways of making money in the private sector through all sorts of things like accommodation, catering and conferencing and so on. And that, I think that detracts from the core teaching. And I think that's why we need properly funded universities and colleges, which may help address some of those future issues. But, you know, independence, and you shouldn't be marking your own homework, as we MSPs don't set our own pay grade, and that's rightly so. So maybe it should be the same for them as well.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. It just leaves me to thank everybody for contributing to the hustings today. I found it very informative and very helpful. I'd like to encourage all members of UCU and anyone listening to make sure they vote. The worst thing that we have is a low turnout in elections. So I'd encourage people to vote and to look at the manifestos of all the different parties that they're interested in. I'm sure you'll take emails and correspondence from members if they're interested and want to follow up questions. So it just leaves me to thank you for participating in this, and thanks everybody for listening. So a round of applause to you.